The blood-red sunset spilled across the Wyoming sky like paint on canvas as Grace Turner stumbled through the doors of the small mercantile in Fort Stanton. Her emerald eyes darted nervously from face to face, one hand clutching her shawl, the other protectively cradling the small swell of her belly beneath her worn dress. She had come too far to turn back now, but the weight of her secrets made each step forward feel like wading through quicksand. Fort Stanton, nestled in the eastern Wyoming Territory in 1875, was little more than a dusty outpost where cattle drivers and settlers crossed paths before continuing their journeys. The town had sprung up around an army fort established to protect the settlers from Indian raids, though now it served mainly as a trading post for ranchers and a resting place for those passing through. Grace had arrived on the afternoon stagecoach, drawing curious glances from the locals. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough, but one in her condition raised eyebrows and invited whispers. At 22, she carried herself with the weary dignity of someone who had lived through far more than her years suggested. "Can I help you, miss?" The shopkeeper's voice startled her from her thoughts. "I'm looking for work," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "and a place to stay." The shopkeeper, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, looked her up and down, his gaze lingering momentarily on her midsection before returning to her face. "Don't have much to offer here," he said, not unkindly. "But Widow Wilson runs a boarding house down the street. As for work—" He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "The Silver Spur Ranch might be hiring. They need a cook, last I heard." Grace thanked him and stepped back into the fading daylight, the paper with directions clutched tightly in her trembling hand. She had exactly $3.17 to her name, all that remained after the stagecoach fare, and weeks on the run. The boarding house was a modest two-story building with faded yellow paint and a sagging porch. Widow Wilson turned out to be a plump, stern-faced woman in her 50s who looked Grace over with sharp eyes, but asked no questions when Grace paid for 2 nights in advance. "Breakfast at 6, was all she said before handing over a key. Grace's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair by the window. As darkness fell, she sat watching the main street, the distant sound of a piano from the saloon drifting through the open window. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the slight flutter of movement within. "Just us now," she whispered. "But we'll be all right." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Grace dressed carefully in her least worn dress, a blue calico that had once belonged to her mother, and set out toward the Silver Spur Ranch. The mile-long walk left her breathless, and she paused at the ranch gate to gather her strength. The Silver Spur was larger than she had expected, with a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, and a large barn. Men were already at work, leading horses to pasture and loading wagons. Grace squared her shoulders and approached the main house, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knocked on the door, and moments later, it swung open to reveal a woman in her 40s with graying brown hair and a flour-dusted apron. "Yes." The woman regarded Grace with curious eyes. "I heard you might need a cook," Grace said, forcing confidence into her voice. "I'm looking for work." The woman's eyes traveled to Grace's midsection, then back to her face. "Come in, then. I'm Mrs. Hargrove, the housekeeper." She led Grace into a spacious kitchen where the warmth of the cook stove and the smell of fresh bread created an immediately comforting atmosphere. "Our last cook left to get married 2 weeks ago," Mrs. Hargrove explained. "Mr. Slater's been making do with me cooking, but I've got enough to manage without adding that to my duties." She gestured to a chair. "Sit. You look ready to fall over." Grace gratefully sank onto the wooden chair. "I'm Grace Turner. I can cook anything you need. I worked in my father's hotel kitchen back east for years." Mrs. Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. "And your condition? When are you due?" Grace's cheeks flushed. "About 4 months from now." "But I can work right up until—" "That's between you and Mr. Slater," Mrs. Hargrove interrupted, not unkindly. "He'll be back around noon. Can you come back then?" Grace nodded, though the thought of the long walk back to town and then returning again made her heart sink. Seeing her expression, Mrs. Hargrove's features softened. "You can wait in here if you'd like. Make yourself useful. Show me what you can do." For the next few hours, Grace worked alongside Mrs. Hargrove, preparing lunch for the ranch hands. Her skilled hands moved confidently as she kneaded dough and chopped vegetables, finding comfort in the familiar tasks. "You certainly know your way around a kitchen," Mrs. Hargrove observed with approval. At noon, boots stomped on the porch and the door swung open. Grace turned, wiping flour from her hands, to find herself looking up into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. Brock Slater filled the doorway with his tall frame, broad shoulders, and presence that seemed to draw all the air from the room. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was in his early 30s. A dark brown Stetson was tipped back on his head, revealing thick chestnut hair. "Mrs. Hargrove, something smells mighty fine in here," he said, his deep voice carrying a hint of Texas in its cadence. Then his eyes found Grace and he paused. "We have a visitor." "This is Miss Turner," Mrs. Hargrove said. "She's here about the cook position." Brock's eyes moved over Grace, taking in her appearance, lingering briefly on her midsection before returning to her face with an unreadable expression. "Miss Turner." He nodded politely. "I appreciate your interest, but she made the stew, Mrs. Hargrove interrupted, gesturing to the pot simmering on the stove, and the bread, and the apple pies cooling by the window. A small smile tugged at the corner of Brock's mouth. "Is that so?" He crossed to the stove and lifted the lid, inhaling the aroma of the beef stew. "Smells promising." "Mr. Slater," Grace said, summoning her courage, "I need this job. I'm a hard worker and I won't let my condition interfere." Brock studied her for a long moment. "Where's your husband, Miss Turner?" Grace's cheeks flamed. "There isn't one." She waited for the judgment, the dismissal that had followed her from town to town. Instead, Brock merely nodded slowly. "The job includes room and board," he said. "You'd stay in the small cabin behind the main house, cooking for me and 8 ranch hands plus Mrs. Hargrove and her husband. 3 meals a day, 6 days a week. Sundays you'd only need to prepare breakfast and dinner." Hope fluttered in Grace's chest. "I can do that." "Pay is $30 a month," he continued. "More than fair considering the accommodations." It was more than fair. It was salvation. "When can you start?" Brock asked. "Right away," Grace replied, hardly able to believe her luck. "I just need to collect my things from town." Brock nodded. "I'll have one of the boys drive you in the wagon." He turned to Mrs. Hargrove. "Let's feed the men then." As Grace served stew to the ranch hands at the long table in the bunkhouse, she felt their curious glances, but met them with a quiet dignity that seemed to earn their respect. By evening, she was settled into the small cabin behind the main house, unpacking her meager belongings and marveling at the turn her fortunes had taken. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with a small bedroom, a sitting area with a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen she wouldn't need to use given her duties in the main house. It was more space than she'd had to call her own in months. As darkness fell, Grace sat on the small porch, watching the lights in the main house and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. For the first time since she'd fled Philadelphia, she allowed herself to relax slightly. Perhaps here, miles from anywhere, she could build a life for herself and her child. The next weeks established a rhythm to her days. Up before dawn to start breakfast, then preparing lunch and dinner, with time in between to bake and plan the next day's meals. The ranch hands appreciated her cooking, and even Mrs. Hargrove grudgingly admitted that Grace's biscuits were better than her own. Brock Slater remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite, thanking her for each meal and occasionally complimenting a particular dish, but he kept his distance. Grace often felt his eyes on her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental, but he asked no questions about her past or her condition. One evening in her third week at Silver Spur, Grace was returning to her cabin when a wave of dizziness overcame her. She stumbled, dropping the lantern she was carrying, and would have fallen had strong arms not caught her. "Whoa there," Brock's voice came from above her. "I've got you." Grace found herself pressed against his chest, his arms supporting her firmly but gently. The scent of leather, horses, and something distinctly male filled her senses. "I'm sorry," she murmured, mortified. "I just got a little light-headed." "When did you last eat?" he asked, still holding her. Grace tried to remember. "Breakfast, I think. I was busy with the preserving Mrs. Hargrove wanted to start." Brock made a disapproving sound. "That won't do, not in your condition." Without warning, he swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Mr. Slater," Grace protested. "I can walk." "Indulge me," he replied, carrying her toward her cabin. "I'd hate for my cook to collapse from hunger." Inside the cabin, he set her carefully in the chair by the fireplace and lit the lantern. In the warm glow, his face looked younger, less weathered by responsibility. "Stay put," he ordered, then disappeared. He returned minutes later with a tray loaded with cold chicken, bread, cheese, and a glass of milk. "Eat," he said, setting it before her. Grace was too hungry to argue. As she ate, Brock sat across from her, watching with a satisfied expression. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished. "You didn't have to go to the trouble." "It's no trouble to look after my people," he replied. Then, with a gentleness that surprised her, he asked, "Are you feeling better now?" The genuine concern in his voice touched something in Grace that she'd thought long buried. "Yes, much better." Brock nodded, seemingly satisfied. "You need to take care of yourself, Miss Turner, not just for your sake." His eyes dropped briefly to her growing belly, and Grace felt herself tense. It was the first time he directly acknowledged her pregnancy since hiring her. "4 months, you said?" he asked quietly. "A little over 5 now," she corrected. Brock nodded. "My sister had 3 little ones before she and her husband moved to California, said the last months were the hardest." His expression softened. "If you need to rest more or if the work gets to be too much, you tell me. We'll figure something out." Grace stared at him, bewildered by his kindness. "Most people wouldn't be so understanding about my situation." A shadow crossed Brock's face. "Most people are too quick to judge what they don't understand." He stood, taking the tray. "Get some rest, Miss Turner." At the door, he paused. "And Grace, you're doing just fine here." It was the first time he'd called her by her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice followed her into her dreams that night. As summer progressed into fall, Grace's body changed more noticeably. Her dresses grew tighter across her expanding middle, and she spent evenings letting out seams and adding panels of fabric from her limited supply. The baby's movements grew stronger, often visible through the fabric of her dress as she worked in the kitchen. She caught Brock watching these movements more than once, a curious expression on his face that she couldn't decipher. He never mentioned them, however, and their interactions remained cordial but distant. That changed one stormy night in September. Grace was awakened by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of her cabin. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, blinding flashes, and between them, she became aware of another sound: water dripping steadily onto the floor. Lighting a lantern, she discovered a leak in the roof directly over her bed. The mattress was already soaked, and water was pooling on the floor. Another flash of lightning showed a crack spreading across the ceiling. Grabbing her shawl, Grace hurried through the downpour to the main house. She hesitated at the back door, reluctant to disturb anyone, but another boom of thunder decided her. She knocked firmly. Moments later, the door opened to reveal Brock in a hastily donned shirt and trousers, his hair tousled from sleep, a kerosene lamp in his hand. "Grace." Concern immediately replaced the sleepiness in his eyes. "What's wrong?" "I'm sorry to wake you," she said, water dripping from her hair. "There's a bad leak in my cabin, right over the bed." Brock frowned. "Come in before you catch your death." He stepped aside to let her enter the warm kitchen. "Are you all right?" "Not hurt, just wet," she assured him, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I wouldn't have bothered you, but you did right," he interrupted. "That cabin's old. I should have had the boys check the roof before the rainy season." He set the lamp on the table. "Wait here." He disappeared down the hallway and returned moments later with a towel and what appeared to be one of his own shirts. "Here," he said, handing them to her. "Dry off and change into this. I'll see about making up a bed for you in one of the spare rooms." Grace hesitated. "I can sleep on a chair in the kitchen. I don't want to put you out." Brock's expression was firm. "You're 6 months along, Grace. You're not sleeping in a chair." He left her to change, and Grace gratefully stripped off her soaked nightgown, dried herself, and pulled on Brock's shirt. It was enormous on her, the sleeves extending well past her fingertips, but it was warm and dry and smelled faintly of him. When Brock returned, he stopped short at the sight of her in his clothing, her damp hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Something flickered in his eyes before he quickly looked away. "Room's ready," he said, his voice gruffer than usual. "Come on." He led her to a small bedroom near the back of the house, where he'd lit a lamp and turned down the covers on a narrow bed. "It's not much," he said, "but it's dry." "It's perfect," Grace assured him. "Thank you." Brock nodded, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "We'll check your cabin in the morning, see what needs fixing. Sleep well, Grace." As he turned to go, Grace impulsively reached out and touched his arm. "Mr. Slater, Brock, thank you for everything." His eyes met hers then, and something passed between them that made Grace's heart race. For a long moment they stood frozen, her hand on his arm, his gaze holding hers. Then Brock cleared his throat and stepped back. "Good night," he said softly, and closed the door behind him. Grace slept fitfully, the unfamiliar bed and the lingering awareness of Brock's presence somewhere in the house making true rest elusive. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of strong arms holding her, keeping her safe from storms both literal and figurative. Morning brought clear skies and the realization that the roof of her cabin had partially collapsed during the night. Had she remained, she might have been seriously injured. "You'll stay in the house until it's fixed," Brock said firmly as they surveyed the damage. "No arguments." For the next 2 weeks, Grace lived in the small bedroom in the main house. She was acutely aware of Brock's presence, passing him in the hallway in the evenings, hearing his boots on the wooden floors, catching glimpses of his private life that she'd not been privy to before. She noticed that he read voraciously in the evenings, books of history and literature that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior. She learned that he sometimes played the harmonica late at night, haunting melodies that drifted under her door and lulled her to sleep. Most of all, she became aware of him watching her not with judgment or suspicion, but with a growing warmth that both frightened and thrilled her. One evening, as Grace was preparing to retire after a long day in the kitchen, Brock appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where she was mending one of her dresses. "May I join you?" he asked. Grace nodded, setting aside her sewing. Brock sat across from her, his large frame making the armchair seem smaller than it was. "The cabin will be ready by the end of the week," he said. "The boys have been working hard on it. New roof, reinforced walls, even a proper stone chimney instead of that old brick one." "That's very generous," Grace said. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble." Brock shrugged. "Winter's coming. Can't have you and the little one freezing out there." The casual mention of her child surprised Grace. It was the first time Brock had directly acknowledged the baby as a person rather than a condition. "Thank you," she said softly. Silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but filled with unspoken words. Finally, Brock leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Grace, I don't mean to pry, but are you running from something? Or someone?" The question, though gently asked, made Grace tense. She looked down at her hands. "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes I see you watching the road like you're expecting someone to appear," Brock said quietly. "And there's fear in your eyes when you do." Grace swallowed hard. This moment had been inevitable, she supposed. Brock had been kind, kinder than she deserved, but no one took in a pregnant, unmarried woman without eventually wanting answers. "Yes," she finally said. "I'm running from someone, the baby's father." Brock's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten on the arms of the chair. "Did he hurt you?" "Not physically," Grace replied. "He was as a wealthy man back east, married. When I told him about the baby, he offered to take care of the problem. When I refused, he threatened to have me committed to an asylum." Her voice trembled. "He has the money and connections to do it. No one would question his word against mine." Brock's expression darkened. "Sounds like a real gentleman." "He's powerful," Grace said simply. "I had no choice but to run." "Does he know where you are?" Grace shook her head. "I've been careful. Changed my name. Turner was my mother's maiden name. Traveled west in stages, never staying too long in one place." She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "Until now." Brock was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. Then he said, "You're safe here, Grace. I promise you that." The simple declaration broke something open inside her. For months, she'd been alone with her fear, constantly looking over her shoulder. Now, this man she barely knew was offering her protection with such quiet certainty that she could almost believe it possible. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough," Brock replied. "I know you work harder than anyone should in your condition. I know you're kind to Mrs. Hargrove even when she's prickly. I know you remember how each ranch hand likes his eggs and that you slip extra biscuits to young Jamie because he's growing so fast." His eyes held hers. "I know enough, Grace." Grace felt the tears she'd been holding back spill down her cheeks. "I've done nothing to deserve your kindness." Brock's expression softened. "Kindness isn't something you earn, Grace. It's something decent folks offer freely." He stood and crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it so they were eye to eye. Hesitantly, he reached out and covered her hand with his own. "You and your baby are welcome here for as long as you want to stay. No conditions, no questions." Grace looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. "Thank you," she whispered. Brock squeezed her hand gently, then rose. "Get some rest. Morning comes early." As he left the room, Grace felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the knot of fear she'd carried for so long. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps the future might hold something more than endless flight. The repaired cabin was indeed ready by the end of the week, transformed from a simple shelter into a cozy home. The roof was new, the walls reinforced and freshly whitewashed. Inside, Grace found new curtains at the windows, a rocking chair by the fireplace, and most surprising of all, a small cradle in the corner of the bedroom, lovingly crafted from polished pine. Mrs. "Hargrove thought you might need it," Brock said when Grace thanked him, though the slight redness in his ears told her who had really made it. Just practical planning. But Grace had seen the careful carving on the headboard, a delicate pattern of leaves and stars, and knew that practicality alone didn't explain such artistry. As October turned to November, Grace's due date drew closer. Her body grew unwieldy, and simple tasks became more challenging. Without being asked, the ranch hands took to carrying water to her kitchen and bringing in firewood. Mrs. Hargrove, who had initially kept Grace at arm's length, began to teach her how to knit baby clothes and offered advice about childbirth drawn from raising 7 children of her own. And Brock watched over her with a quiet attentiveness that spoke volumes. He made sure she ate properly, limited her heavier duties, and often found excuses to check on her throughout the day. In the evenings, he sometimes joined her on the porch of her cabin, the two of them talking until the stars emerged in the vast Wyoming sky. Grace learned that Brock had inherited the ranch from his uncle 5 years earlier, that he'd been born in Texas, but had come north with his family as a boy during the war, that he had a sister in California and parents buried side by side in a small cemetery just beyond the north pasture. In turn, she shared pieces of herself, stories of her childhood in Philadelphia, her father's hotel, her dreams of someday seeing the ocean. She didn't speak of the baby's father again, and Brock didn't ask, but the shadow of that man and the threat he represented lingered between them. One clear November evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Grace felt the baby shift and kick particularly hard. She gasped at the force of it, her hand going to her side. "What is it?" Brock asked, immediately concerned. "Should I get Mrs. Hargrove?" "No," Grace assured him with a small laugh. "The baby's just very active tonight. Feel." Without thinking, she reached for his hand and placed it on the side of her belly where the baby was kicking. Brock froze, his eyes widening as he felt the strong movement beneath his palm. His expression transformed from surprise to wonder, and something else, a tenderness that made Grace's breath catch. "That's something," he murmured, his hand warm through the fabric of her dress. The intimacy of the moment struck Grace suddenly, and she started to withdraw her hand, but Brock gently held it in place. "It's a miracle, isn't it?" he said softly. "New life." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. For so long, her pregnancy had been a source of shame and fear. To see it through Brock's eyes as something miraculous was overwhelming. "You're going to be a wonderful mother, Grace," Brock said, finally withdrawing his hand. "This little one is lucky to have you." "You don't know that," Grace whispered. "I'm so afraid I'll fail." "Every parent worth their salt is afraid of that," Brock replied. "My pa used to say that fear is what keeps you careful." He smiled at her. "But love is what makes you brave." Grace looked at him, this man who had opened his home and his heart to her without hesitation. "You make me brave, Brock Slater." Something flickered in his eyes then, an emotion too complex to name. For a moment Grace thought he might reach for her, but instead he stood. "It's getting cold. You should go inside." The next morning, Grace was kneading bread dough when she heard the clatter of hooves in the yard. Through the kitchen window, she saw Brock greeting a visitor, a well-dressed man on a fine horse who seemed out of place in the rugged ranch setting. Mrs. Hargrove appeared at her elbow. "That's Mr. Fontaine from town, lawyer and postmaster. Wonder what brings him out here." Grace felt a prickle of unease. In her experience, lawyers rarely brought good news. A few minutes later, the kitchen door opened and Brock entered, his expression guarded. "Grace, could I speak with you for a moment?" In private, her heart pounding, Grace followed him to his study, a small room off the main hall that she'd rarely entered. Once the door closed behind them, Brock turned to her, a letter in his hand. "This came for you," he said. Mr. Fontaine recognized the name from a bulletin that was circulated to postmasters. Grace stared at the envelope, her blood turning to ice. The handwriting was painfully familiar, elegant, assured, the script of a man accustomed to having his words obeyed. "He's found me," she whispered. Brock's face was grim. "The letter is addressed to Grace Bennett. Is that your real name?" She nodded, unable to speak. "You don't have to open it," Brock said. "We can burn it right now." Grace shook her head. "No, I need to know what he says." With trembling hands, she took the envelope and broke the seal. The letter was brief, its tone coldly businesslike. "Grace, your disappearance has caused considerable inconvenience. I've located you through means that need not concern you. I will arrive in Fort Stanton on November 20th to resolve our situation permanently. Arrangements have been made at a private sanatorium in Denver. After the child is born, it will be placed with a suitable family, and you will remain under treatment until you've regained your senses. This is non-negotiable. HB." Grace's legs gave way beneath her. Brock caught her, guiding her to a chair. "Grace, what is it?" She handed him the letter, unable to speak through her terror. As Brock read it, his expression darkened to something she'd never seen before, a cold fury that transformed his gentle features. "November 20th, he said. "That's less than a week from now." Grace nodded, her hand protectively covering her belly. "He's going to take my baby," she whispered, "and lock me away where no one will ever find me." Brock knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "Listen to me, Grace. That is not going to happen. I won't let it. You don't understand. He's powerful, connected. He'll have papers, doctors who'll swear I'm unstable." "This is Wyoming territory, not Philadelphia," Brock said firmly. "His money might talk in town, but out here, a man is judged by his actions, not his bank account." His grip on her hands tightened. "I'll protect you, Grace, both of you." Grace wanted desperately to believe him, but fear had its claws too deeply in her. "He won't stop, ever." Brock was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "There is a way to put you beyond his reach legally." "How?" "Marriage," Brock said simply. "As your husband, I would have legal authority over you, not him. He couldn't force you into any institution without my consent, which he would never get." Grace stared at him, stunned. "You can't mean—" "I do," Brock said, his gaze steady. "Marry me, Grace." "But why would you do that?" "Tie yourself to me, to my problems." Something flickered across Brock's face, an emotion too quickly suppressed for Grace to identify. "You need protection. I can provide it. It's as simple as that." But it wasn't simple at all, and they both knew it. A marriage, even one entered into for protection, was a sacred bond. "It would be a marriage in name only," Brock added, as if reading her thoughts. "You would have your cabin, your independence. Nothing would change except your legal status." Grace's mind raced. It was a solution, perhaps the only one that could save her and her child. But the thought of binding Brock to her circumstances, of denying him the chance for a real marriage someday, filled her with guilt. "You won't want me when you know everything," she said softly. "The full truth." Brock's expression didn't waver. "Try me." Grace took a deep breath. "The man who's coming, Herbert Blackwell, he's one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia. Banking, railroads, shipping. My father's hotel catered to his associates, and I often served at their private dinners." Her voice faltered. "Herbert took an interest in me. He was charming, sophisticated. I was flattered by his attention." She looked down at her hands. "I knew he was married, but he told me his wife was sickly, that theirs was a marriage in name only. I believed him, or wanted to. When I realized I was carrying his child, I thought." She shook her head at her own naivety. "I thought he would be pleased. Instead, he told me to handle it discreetly and offered money to make the problem disappear." Brock's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. When I refused, he became angry, said I was trying to trap him, to ruin him. He threatened to have me committed, to tell everyone I was delusional, that I'd fabricated our relationship. His wife comes from an influential family. No one would question his word against mine. Grace met Brock's eyes. So I ran. I've been running ever since. Brock was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You didn't do anything I need to forgive, Grace. You trusted the wrong man. It happens." "I'm carrying another man's child," Grace said, her voice breaking. "A married man's child. That's not something most people can overlook." "I'm not most people," Brock replied. Then, with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes, he placed his hand on her belly. "And this child is innocent of its father's sins." The baby kicked against his hand, as if in agreement, and the faintest smile touched Brock's lips. "You won't want me when you know," she said, echoing the fear that had haunted her for months. The cowboy touched her pregnant belly and smiled, his eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty. "I already know all I need to know, Grace, and I'm still here, still asking." Grace searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or reluctance, but found only resolve and something deeper, something that made her heart race. "Yes," she whispered, "I'll marry you." The wedding took place the next day in the ranch house parlor, with Mrs. Hargrove, her husband, and Mr. Fontaine as witnesses. The ceremony was brief, the words ancient and solemn. When Mr. Fontaine pronounced them husband and wife, Brock leaned down and placed the gentlest of kisses on Grace's lips there first. Grace felt the whisper of that kiss long after it ended, a promise of something she dared not name. That evening, Brock walked her to her cabin. At the door, he hesitated. "I meant what I said, Grace. Nothing has to change. This is still your home, your space." Grace nodded, both relieved and strangely disappointed. "Thank you, Brock, for everything." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather-light. "Sleep well, Mrs. Slater." The new name startled her. Mrs. Slater. She was no longer Grace Turner or Grace Bennett, but Grace Slater, wife of Brock Slater. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As November 20th approached, tension at the Silver Spur mounted. Brock had shared the situation with his most trusted ranch hands, and they took turns watching the road, alert for any sign of Herbert Blackwell's arrival. Grace moved through her days in a haze of anxious anticipation, jumping at every sound, her hands constantly protective over her belly. At night, she lay awake, imagining confrontations, escapes, disasters. Brock was a constant presence, steady and reassuring. He made sure she was never alone, finding reasons to be near the house, sending ranch hands on errands that kept them close by. His protective instincts should have made Grace feel safer, but it only heightened her awareness of the danger they faced. On the morning of November 20th, Grace was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of an approaching carriage. Her heart leaped into her throat and the bowl she was holding slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. Mrs. Hargrove was at her side instantly. "Go to the back room," she said, her usually stern face softened with concern. "Mr. Slater will handle this." Grace shook her head. "No. I need to face him." Through the window, she watched as a sleek black carriage pulled into the yard. It was expensive, out of place among the ranch wagons and saddle horses. The driver, a man in a dark coat, jumped down and opened the door. Herbert Blackwell stepped out, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver-streaked dark hair perfectly groomed. He looked around the ranch yard with evident distaste, like a man forced to wade through filth. Behind him, a second man emerged from the carriage, taller, broader, with the hard eyes of someone accustomed to violence. Not a gentleman but a hired enforcer, dressed to pass for respectable but betrayed by his watchful stance and the bulge of a weapon under his coat. Grace's blood ran cold. Herbert hadn't come just to talk. The kitchen door opened and Brock entered. He was dressed in his usual ranch clothes, durable trousers, a faded shirt, weathered boots, but he'd added his good vest and had combed his hair neatly. He carried no visible weapon, though Grace knew he kept a Colt revolver in his desk. "He's here," Brock said simply. "With another man," Grace nodded, her mouth too dry for speech. "You don't have to see him," Brock reminded her. Grace squared her shoulders. "Yes, I do. We do, together." Something like pride flickered in Brock's eyes. He nodded and offered his arm. Grace took it, drawing strength from his solid presence as they walked to the front of the house. Herbert and his companion were waiting on the porch when Brock opened the door. Up close, Herbert looked older than Grace remembered, the lines around his mouth deeper, his eyes colder. "Mr. Blackwell, I presume," Brock said, his voice neutral but with a steel undertone that Grace had never heard before. "I'm Brock Slater. This is my wife, Grace." Herbert's eyes narrowed at the word wife, darting from Brock to Grace and back. "Your wife? How convenient." His gaze settled on Grace's belly, visible beneath her apron. "And just in time, I see." "What do you want, Herbert?" Grace asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Herbert smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "I think you know, my dear. I've come to take you somewhere you can receive proper care. Your condition has clearly affected your judgment." "My wife is in perfect health, Mr. Blackwell," Brock said, "and her judgment is sound. She's chosen to make her home here with me." Herbert's smile thinned. "A charming story, but I have documentation from reputable physicians diagnosing Grace with nervous hysteria and delusions. And I have a court order from Pennsylvania authorizing me, as her former employer and concerned guardian, to place her under medical supervision." He produced a folded document from his coat. "Quite legal, I assure you. That paper has no authority in Wyoming territory," Brock said calmly. "And as Grace's husband, I have sole legal responsibility for her welfare." Herbert's composure slipped for just a moment, anger flashing across his features before he controlled it. "A marriage of convenience won't stand up to scrutiny, Mr. Slater, especially when the bride's mental competence is in question. Our marriage was performed by a licensed justice of the peace and witnessed by respectable citizens of this county," Brock replied. "It will stand up to any scrutiny you care to apply." Herbert studied Brock, reassessing. Then he turned to Grace. "Grace, be reasonable. You know you're not equipped to raise a child, especially not here in this." He looked around with distaste, wilderness. "Come with me now, and I'll ensure you receive the finest care. The child will be placed with a good family." Grace felt Brock's arm tense beneath her hand, but his voice remained steady. "The child will be raised by its mother and by me, its legal father, here on our ranch." Herbert's expression hardened. "I see. Well, I had hoped to resolve this amicably, but since you insist on being difficult—" He nodded to his companion, who stepped forward, his hand moving toward his coat. Brock moved faster than Grace would have thought possible, placing himself in front of her and drawing his revolver from where it had been concealed at the small of his back. "I wouldn't," he said quietly, the gun aimed at the enforcer's chest. "Not unless you fancy being buried on my land." The enforcer froze, eyes calculating. Herbert's face flushed with anger. "How dare you threaten us? You know who I am." "I know exactly who you are," Brock replied, his voice cold. "A man who abandoned his responsibilities. A man who threatened a woman carrying his child. A man who's about 10 seconds away from discovering that money doesn't stop bullets." For a long moment, tension crackled in the air. Then Herbert raised a hand, stopping his companion's advance. "This isn't over, Slater. I have connections even in this God-forsaken territory, judges, lawmakers. And I have neighbors, Brock replied. Men who don't take kindly to outsiders threatening one of their own. You might buy a judge in Fort Stanton, Mr. Blackwell, but you can't buy the 40 armed ranchers who'll stand with me if you try to take my wife. Herbert's gaze moved from Brock to Grace, cold calculation in his eyes. And what of you, Grace? Are you prepared to drag your child into scandal? Because I assure you, if you force my hand, I will make public every sordid detail of our association. Your reputation will be in tatters. Grace felt a tremor of fear, but then Brock's hand found hers, warm and steadying. She lifted her chin. My reputation is as Mrs. Brock Slater, a rancher's wife in Wyoming territory. Your words have no power here, Herbert. Something in her voice, her stance, made Herbert hesitate. For the first time, he seemed to realize that the frightened girl he'd expected to find had been replaced by a woman of unexpected strength. The child is mine, he said, making one last attempt. My blood. No, Grace said firmly. This child belongs to me and to my husband. You surrendered any claim when you suggested I handle the problem discreetly. Herbert's jaw tightened. He looked from Grace to Brock, assessing his options, and evidently found them lacking. With a curt nod, he stepped back. Very well, for now. He turned to his companion. Come, Davis, we're leaving. As they walked back to their carriage, Herbert paused and looked back. This isn't finished, Grace. A day will come when your cowboy isn't beside you, and I'll be waiting. Brock's arm circled Grace's waist, pulling her closer to his side. That day won't come, Blackwell, not as long as I'm breathing. They watched in silence as the carriage pulled away, the horses' hooves raising dust in the yard. Only when it disappeared down the road did Grace realize she was trembling. Brock led her gently back inside the house, to the kitchen where Mrs. Hargrove was pretending not to have been listening at the window. She took one look at Grace's face and silently poured a cup of strong tea, adding a spoonful of honey. Drink, she ordered, placing it in Grace's hands. Good for the nerves. Grace obeyed, the hot liquid warming her from the inside. When she looked up, she found Brock watching her with an expression that made her heart twist. Thank you, she said quietly, for standing with me. Brock's eyes held hers. Always, he said, the single word a promise that resonated through her. That night, as Grace prepared for bed in her cabin, a soft knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Brock standing on the porch, his expression serious. May I come in? Grace stepped aside, suddenly conscious of her nightgown and wrapper, her hair loose around her shoulders. Brock entered but remained near the door, maintaining a respectful distance. I've been thinking, he said. Blackwell won't give up easily. He strikes me as a man used to getting his way. Grace nodded. He is. His threat about waiting for a time when I'm not with you that concerns me. Brock ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. I think we need to consider that he might try again, perhaps when the baby comes. Fear clutched at Grace's heart. What can we do? I've sent word to some friends in Fort Stanton, asked them to keep an eye out for Blackwell or his man, and I've arranged for extra hands to stay close to the ranch for the next few weeks. Brock hesitated, then continued. But I'm worried about you being alone out here, especially at night. Grace understood what he wasn't saying. You think I should move back to the main house? I think, Brock said carefully, that a real marriage might offer more protection than our current arrangement. Grace's breath caught. What do you mean? Brock moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. I mean that if we were truly husband and wife in all ways, no one could question the legitimacy of our union. No court would separate us. Brock, Grace whispered, you don't have to do that. You've already done so much. This isn't about obligation, Grace. He took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "It's about what I want." "And what do you want?" Brock's eyes darkened. "You," he said simply. "I have from the moment you walked into my kitchen, determined and proud despite everything you'd been through." Grace stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "But the baby will be my child in every way that matters," Brock said firmly. "I already love it, Grace, because it's part of you." Tears filled Grace's eyes. "I don't deserve you." Brock shook his head. "It's not about deserving, it's about loving." He cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Grace Slater. I think I have almost from the beginning." Grace's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "I love you too," she whispered, the words she'd kept locked away finally set free. "So much." Brock's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her, not the chaste peck of their wedding, but a real kiss, tender and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Brock rested his forehead against hers. "Be my wife, Grace." In truth, not just in name. Grace's answer was to rise on tiptoe and kiss him again, her arms circling his neck, her body pressing against his as much as her rounded belly would allow. They were married in truth that night, discovering each other with tenderness and growing passion. Brock's reverence for her changed body brought tears to Grace's eyes the way he kissed her swollen belly. The gentle care he took with her comfort, the look of wonder in his eyes as he made her his wife in every sense. Later, as they lay tangled in the narrow bed, Brock's hand resting protectively on her belly, Grace felt a peace she hadn't known in months. Whatever the future held, she would face it with this man beside her. "I was so afraid," she murmured, nestled against his chest. "That night I told you about Herbert, about the baby. I said you wouldn't want me when you knew." Brock's arms tightened around her. "I already knew all I needed to know, that you were brave, kind, strong." He kissed the top of her head. The rest was just details. December arrived with bitter cold and the promise of snow. Grace and Brock settled into their new life together, sharing the cabin that had once been hers alone. Each night, Brock would build a fire in the hearth, and they would sit together, planning for the future, discussing names for the baby, falling deeper in love with every passing day. There was no further sign of Herbert Blackwell, though Brock maintained his vigilance. The ranch hands kept watch on the road, and friends in town sent word of any strangers passing through. As the weeks passed without incident, Grace began to hope that perhaps Herbert had decided the fight wasn't worth the trouble. As Christmas approached, the baby grew increasingly active, kicking and shifting as if impatient to join the world. Grace found herself waddling rather than walking, her back aching, her nights restless. Brock was endlessly patient, massaging her swollen feet, building extra pillows for her comfort, listening to her fears about the coming birth. "Mrs. Hargrove has delivered more babies than the doctor in Fort Stanton," he assured her one evening as they sat by the fire. "And her daughter-in-law is a trained midwife. They'll be here when the time comes." Grace nodded, her hand absently rubbing circles on her belly. "I know, it's just, I wish my mother were here. She died when I was 16, but she'd know what to say, what to do." Brock covered her hand with his. "What would she tell you?" Grace smiled softly. "To trust myself. That women have been doing this since the beginning of time." She looked up at him. "And to trust you." "Smart woman, your mother," Brock said with a gentle smile. Christmas Eve brought the first heavy snow of the season, transforming the ranch into a wonderland of white. The ranch hands who hadn't gone home for the holiday gathered in the main house for a feast prepared by Grace and Mrs. Hargrove, followed by singing and storytelling around the fire. Brock presented Grace with a gift, a beautiful silver locket on a delicate chain. Inside was room for 2 small portraits, For you and the baby, he explained. And someday, maybe others. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she fastened it around her neck. It's perfect. Her gift to him was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue that matched his eyes, worked on secretly during the quiet afternoons when he was out with the cattle. That night, as they walked back to their cabin through the gently falling snow, Brock suddenly stopped and tilted his head back, looking up at the star-filled sky. "What is it?" Grace asked. "Just thinking about how much has changed since last Christmas," he said. "I was alone then. Now I have you and soon our child." He looked down at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "I never thought I could be this happy." Grace reached up to touch his face, her heart so full it ached. "Nor I." As they continued toward home, a sharp pain suddenly gripped Grace's abdomen, making her gasp and clutch at Brock's arm. "Grace," alarm sharpened his voice. "What is it?" "I don't know," she said, breathing through the pain. "Just a cramp, I think." But as they reached the cabin, another pain struck, stronger than the first. Grace recognized it then for what it was. "Brock," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I think the baby's coming." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Mrs. Hargrove and her daughter-in-law, Sarah, arrived quickly, bringing with them clean linens, herbal tonics, and the calm competence of women who had guided many new lives into the world. Brock was banished to the main house with the other men, though he protested leaving Grace's side. "I'll be fine," she assured him, squeezing his hand before another contraction took her breath away. "Go, this is women's work now." The labor was long and difficult. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world in silence. Inside, Grace fought the hardest battle of her life, drawing strength from the encouragement of the women around her, and the knowledge that Brock was waiting, just beyond the door, for their child to arrive. In the deepest part of the night, as Christmas Eve became Christmas Day, Grace gave a final, tremendous push, and her child slid into the waiting hands of Sarah Hargrove. "A boy," Sarah announced as the infant's lusty cry filled the cabin. "A fine, strong boy." Tears of joy and exhaustion streamed down Grace's face as the baby was placed on her chest, his skin against hers, his cries quieting as he found himself in his mother's arms. "Hello, little one," she whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the perfect shell of his ears, the bow of his mouth. "I've waited so long to meet you." The cabin door opened and Brock stood there, snow dusting his shoulders, his face a study in barely contained emotion. "Come meet your son," Grace said, her voice thick with tears. Brock approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. As he gazed down at the small bundle in Grace's arms, his expression transformed wonder, love, and fierce protection all mingled in his eyes. "He's perfect," he whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "Just perfect." Mrs. Hargrove and Sarah discreetly withdrew, leaving the new family alone. Brock sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Grace, the other hand gently touching the baby's dark hair. "What shall we call him?" he asked. Grace looked down at her son, this miracle born of pain and hope. "I thought perhaps Thomas, after your father." Brock's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas," he repeated, testing the name. "Thomas Slater, it suits him." "Thomas Brock Slater," Grace amended. "For both the men who gave him life." Brock's arms tightened around them both. "I love you," he whispered, "both of you." As dawn broke on Christmas Day, snow still falling gently outside the window, Grace held her son in one arm and her husband's hand with the other, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect peace. Little Thomas thrived through the winter months, growing stronger each day. He had Grace's emerald eyes and a thatch of dark hair that Brock insisted came from his side of the family, though Grace knew better. Still, She never contradicted him. In all the ways that mattered, Thomas was Brock's son. Brock proved to be a natural father, as gentle with the baby as he was with newborn calves, as patient during sleepless nights as he was training young horses. He would walk the floor with Thomas for hours, singing old Texas lullabies in his deep voice, the baby nestled securely against his broad chest. By spring, Grace had regained her strength and then some. The hard work of ranch life suited her, building muscles she'd never had in Philadelphia. Her skin tanned golden in the Wyoming sun, and her step grew lighter as the fear of Herbert Blackwell receded with each peaceful month. In April, just as the first wildflowers were beginning to dot the meadows, a letter arrived from Fort Stanton. Grace recognized the handwriting of Mr. Fontaine, the lawyer, and felt a momentary flutter of anxiety. Brock opened it at the breakfast table, his expression guarded as he read. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "What is it?" Grace asked, shifting Thomas to her other hip. "News about Blackwell," Brock said, passing her the letter. "Seems he's had troubles of his own." The letter detailed how Herbert Blackwell had returned to Philadelphia to find his financial empire crumbling. Several investments had failed catastrophically, and there were whispers of fraud. His wife had filed for divorce, a scandal that had rocked Philadelphia society. Blackwell was now fighting to save what remained of his fortune and reputation. "He won't be bothering us again," Brock said, taking Thomas from her arms and bouncing him gently. "He has bigger problems now." Relief washed through Grace like a cleansing tide. For the first time, she felt truly free of the past, able to embrace her future without looking over her shoulder. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside them, Grace turned to Brock. "I've been thinking," she said. "Dangerous," Brock teased, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Grace smiled. "I was thinking that Thomas might like a brother or sister someday. Not too soon," she added hastily, "but someday." Brock's expression softened. He took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I'd like that," he said, "very much." "And I was thinking," Grace continued, "that I'd like to plant a garden. Vegetables, herbs, maybe some flowers, make this place even more of a home." "Whatever you want," Brock said. "This is your home, Grace, for as long as you want it to be." Grace leaned into his embrace, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. "Forever," she whispered. "I want it to be forever." The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Thomas grew from a baby to a toddler, then to a sturdy little boy with his mother's quick mind and his father's steady nature. When he was 3, he was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, born during a summer thunderstorm with her father assisting in the delivery when the midwife couldn't reach them in time. By 1882, the Silver Spur had prospered under Brock and Grace's joint stewardship. They had added a new wing to the main house, expanded the herd, and hired more hands to work the growing operation. Grace's garden flourished, providing vegetables and herbs not just for their table but for the whole ranch. Thomas, now 7, was already showing a talent for working with horses, while 4-year-old Elizabeth preferred to help her mother in the kitchen or garden. A third child, James, had joined the family the previous year, completing their circle with his sunny nature and infectious laugh. One warm evening in June, as Grace sat on the porch mending one of Thomas's perpetually torn shirts, Brock joined her, a letter in his hand. "This came today," he said, sitting beside her. "From Philadelphia." Grace's hand stilled. "Herbert," Brock shook his head, "his lawyer. Herbert Blackwell died last month. Heart failure." He watched her face carefully. "Are you all right?" Grace considered the news, searching her heart for any lingering emotion toward the man who had once caused her so much fear and pain. She found only a distant pity. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm all right." She looked toward the meadow where Thomas and Elizabeth were playing, their laughter carried on the breeze. "Better than all right." Brock followed her gaze, his expression softening as he watched their children. "We've built something good here, haven't we?" Grace nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "Something beautiful." That night as they lay in bed, the moonlight painting silver patterns on the quilt, Brock propped himself on one elbow to look down at her. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Coming here marrying me?" Grace reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that 7 years of Wyoming weather and fatherhood had etched around his eyes. "Never," she said. "Not for a single moment." Brock smiled, the same smile that had warmed her heart on that long-ago day when he'd touched her pregnant belly and told her he wanted her, secrets and all. "I was so afraid," Grace whispered. "I said you wouldn't want me when you knew everything about me." "And I knew better," Brock said, lowering his head to kiss her softly. "I knew I'd want you forever." As the moon continued its journey across the Wyoming sky, casting its gentle light on the Silver Spur Ranch, Grace Slater held her husband close and gave thanks for the fear that had driven her west, for the courage that had allowed her to stay, and for the love that had transformed a temporary shelter into a permanent home. In the years that followed, the Silver Spur Ranch became known throughout the region not just for its fine cattle and horses, but for the warmth of its hospitality and the strength of the family at its heart. Thomas grew into a fine young man who eventually took over much of the ranch's operation, allowing Brock and Grace more time to enjoy their growing family of grandchildren. Elizabeth married the son of a neighboring rancher, combining their lands and fortunes, while young James surprised everyone by going east to study medicine, returning to establish the first proper hospital in Fort Stanton. And through it all, through the good years and the lean, through blizzards and droughts, through joys and sorrows, Brock and Grace Slater remained each other's constant, the cowboy who had seen beyond society's judgment to the worth of a woman in need, and the woman who had found the courage to believe in love again. Sometimes, visitors to the ranch would remark on the special bond between the aging couple, the way they seemed to communicate without words, the tenderness in Brock's eyes when he looked at his wife, the soft smile that Grace reserved only for him. "How did you know?" a young ranch hand once asked Brock as they watched Grace working in her garden, her once auburn hair now streaked with silver. "How did you know she was the one?" Brock smiled, his weathered face creasing with the memory of a frightened young woman standing in his kitchen, pride and fear at war in her emerald eyes. "Sometimes," he said, "love isn't about knowing, it's about choosing. Every day you choose the person you love, secrets and all. And if you're very lucky, they choose you right back." And as if she felt his gaze, Grace looked up from her garden and smiled at him across the yard, the years falling away in that moment, both of them remembering a different garden, a different time when a cowboy had touched a pregnant woman's belly and smiled, choosing love over judgment, hope over fear, forever over what might have been.